3 daughters. 1 father. A wilderness that swallowed them whole, but what if the killer never planned to come out either? This isn't just a story about murder, it's a psychological descent into the mind of a man everyone trusted. Until he vanished. If this story chills you like it chilled us, tap that subscribe button for more terrifying true crime stories, only on Mr. Dar's Nights. Turn on the bell, because the next mystery might already be unfolding right in your town. There are places in America where silence has a weight to it, where even the wind seems hesitant to speak, and the trees hold on to secrets like tombstones hold names. One such place exists deep within Washington state's dense wilderness, nestled behind forgotten hiking trails and pine-covered ridges. That's where the story begins, not with a scream, but with an unbearable stillness. A stillness that came after 3 little girls never returned from a camping trip with their father. It was early June when 2 seasoned hikers stumbled onto something that would change the course of an entire town. The weather had been uncharacteristically mild that day, the kind of day where the forest air smells like damp moss and wet earth. But something felt wrong. Off the beaten path near Rock Island Campground, they caught sight of something that didn't belong, bright, unnatural colors peeking through tall grass. What they found wasn't wildlife or camping gear. It was death. 3 lifeless bodies, laid side by side in a clearing, as if someone had carefully arranged them to be found. The girls were young, barely old enough to tie their own shoes without help. Each one wore a pastel hoodie and light sneakers now caked in mud. Their faces were still. No signs of struggle, no visible wounds. They almost looked like they were sleeping, if not for the cold blue tinge to their skin and the eerie absence of breath in the air around them. Their backpacks, unopened, lay near their heads like silent companions. A lunchbox still zipped, a juice pouch unopened. Whoever left them there had ensured it would be quiet, controlled, clinical. The authorities were called immediately. Within hours, yellow tape surrounded the clearing, crime scene investigators combed through brush, and word of the tragedy spread like wildfire. But as the town processed what had happened, one question echoed louder than the rest: where was Travis Decker? Travis was the girl's father. A decorated former Army medic turned HVAC technician who had gained partial custody after a lengthy, bitter divorce. According to court documents, he was granted visitation for the weekend, expected to return the girls to their mother by Sunday evening. That never happened. Calls went unanswered. Text showed as delivered, but not read. At first, people thought they'd lost signal in the forest. Maybe the hike went longer than expected. But as hours turned to days, worry turned to dread. There was no sign of Travis. No footprints beyond the clearing, no campsite, no car parked in the usual trailhead lots. His cell phone pinged once 2 nights earlier, briefly connecting with a tower 15 miles southeast of the discovery site, and then silence. What made it worse was that the bodies had been freshly placed. The girls hadn't been there long. It was as if they had been moved, hidden for a time, and returned under cover of darkness. News helicopters buzzed overhead by morning. Reporters swarmed the trailhead, hungry for any scrap of detail the sheriff's department would release. Photos of Travis and his daughters were plastered across every outlet: sunlit selfies, backyard barbecues, family vacations that now looked sinister in retrospect. And yet, no one could piece together how a weekend getaway turned into a triple homicide. Forensic teams noted something disturbing. There was no blood at the scene. No bruising. Toxicology reports would take days to process, but the absence of visible injury raised grim possibilities. Suffocation. Poison. Cold exposure. But even more troubling was the precision of it all. Whoever left the bodies knew what they were doing. They weren't rushed. There was no panic. Just silence. The town of Arden Hill, population 9,300, was no stranger to hardship. But this was different. This was personal. Travis wasn't some stranger. He'd grown up there. Played high school football, did charity work at the local VA center, and even ran a summer archery program for kids. Everyone knew him. Everyone liked him. Which made the idea of him being involved unthinkable. And yet, the alternative was even worse. If Travis didn't kill them, then someone else did, and took him too. But then why were there no signs of a struggle? The investigators began to dig, not just through the soil and brush of the crime scene, but through the life Travis had lived in the months leading up to the murders. Custody records, mental health evaluations, military discharge files. What they found would be enough to reopen wounds no one in the town even knew existed. But before they got that far, the most urgent task was finding Travis Decker. Alive or dead. Within 48 hours, the area was swarmed with search parties. K9 units, volunteer trackers, even heat-sensing drones combed the nearby forest. But there was no scent. No trace. As if he had vanished into the trees, or never left them at all. And beneath it all, one grim possibility took hold like ivy on cold stone. Maybe Travis didn't run from what happened, maybe he walked away satisfied. Travis Decker was the kind of man who understood both precision and unpredictability. He carried his military past with quiet pride, a former Army medic trained to assess trauma in seconds, to keep a steady hand when others faltered. His fellow servicemen remembered him for calm under fire, a man who could stitch wounds by flashlight amid chaos. Back home in Arden Hill, he channeled that same discipline into his work as an HVAC technician, diagnosing and repairing complex systems with methodical care. Friends joked that he could fix anything, a broken heater, a strained relationship, even a broken spirit. Yet when June began, that steadiness dissolved into a puzzle no one could solve. Custody orders painted a picture of his life in turmoil. He'd fought hard for weekends with his daughters after a messy divorce shattered the family's stability. The court filings spoke of bitterness, late-night arguments over visitation schedules, and a judge's warning that Travis seek counseling for mounting stress. His ex-wife described his loving nature at first, a devoted father who taught his girls to play catch and read bedtime stories by flashlight during power outages. But letters from that counselor hinted at sleepless nights, mounting paranoia, and a desperation that grew with every denied custody change. On the morning he was supposed to return the girls, Travis was gone. His red Ford pickup sat idling at the campsite's edge, keys in the ignition, daughter-sized backpacks stashed in the bed. The fire pit lay cold, ashes undisturbed. It was as if someone pressed pause on his life and walked away, leaving nothing but echoes. Investigators found his wallet, and everything in it, credit cards, a worn Army ID, photographs of his daughters loose between plastic laminates. His cell phone held a final screenshot of a weather alert for the campground region, taken hours earlier. No notes. No goodbyes. The more detectives dug into Travis's final hours, the more contradictions emerged. Credit card records showed no transactions beyond that morning. GPS data from his phone stopped abruptly at 9:14 a.m., placing him on a steep forest trail far from any main road. Yet eyewitness reports surfaced of a man matching his description walking near the trailhead at dusk, long past official curfew. Security camera footage from a nearby gas station was grainy, but the jacket, the gait, the pack slung over one shoulder all pointed to Travis. No one could confirm whether he was alone or with someone else. Locals whispered that Travis had been uneasy in the weeks before the trip. A coworker recalled him riffling through maps and survival guides at odd hours, muttering about backup plans and always preparing for the worst. At neighborhood barbecues, he avoided eye contact and left early, clutching a thermos of steaming coffee like a talisman against sleeplessness. Some chalked it up to typical single-parent stress, others feared it hinted at something darker. Even his closest friends admitted they sensed a shift. He stopped accepting invitations, preferring solitude deep in the woods where cell service was spotty and company minimal. There he felt safe, or so he said. Journal entries recovered from his home computer spoke of disillusionment with the legal system, of believing that only he could ensure his daughter's safety. A chilling passage described a dream in which he wandered through a forest, calling their names until the trees answered with silence. He awoke in a cold sweat, convinced that danger lurked just beyond the campsite's firelight. When the search intensified, volunteers found signs he had set up makeshift shelters, branches tied with paracord, a small pile of firewood arranged like an altar. They found empty canteens and crumpled ration wrappers in a shallow ditch. But they also stumbled across discarded gear soaked in rain, as if he had moved on hastily in the dark. Bloodhounds lost his scent near a creek, only to regain it half a mile away near an abandoned logging road. Theories abounded. He was evading capture, hiding from himself, or attempting to lure searchers into a trap. Rumors spread that he'd become a survivalist extremist, haunted by conspiracy theories, living off-grid permanently. Online, threads speculated he had joined a militia, or that he staged the entire tragedy for some unknown purpose. Investigators dismissed many of these as distractions, but they couldn't ignore a disturbing fact. Travis's mental evaluation 6 weeks earlier had flagged signs of acute paranoia. He described feeling watched, convinced a shadowy presence trailed him through the woods. The psychologist warned the court that without intervention, Travis might pose a risk to himself or others. Yet even as authorities circulated his photo nationwide, no credible leads emerged. An unmarked satellite phone was discovered buried beneath pine needles near the crime scene, but traces of its use were wiped clean. A drone spotted a figure matching Travis's build crouched beside a river at dawn, but by the time ground teams arrived, only footprints remained, leading back into the forest's impenetrable depths. As days turned into a week, the line between victim and suspect blurred. Was Travis Decker the hunted or the hunter? Did he vanish to escape blame, or did he vanish because he was already beyond the reach of this world? In Arden Hill, where everyone knew his name, families locked their doors and taught their children to fear the shadows beneath the pines. Amid the mounting tension, one truth stood clear: the man who had once saved lives in war was now saving himself from an enemy no one could name. And until he was found, alive, in custody, or confirmed dead, the question would reverberate with every rustle of leaves: what happened to Travis Decker? Long before Travis Decker became the center of a nationwide manhunt, he was simply a father who loved to capture moments. His phone was filled with images that, in retrospect, feel almost cruel in their innocence: sun-drenched afternoons at playgrounds, little hands holding marshmallows over a campfire, and 3 young girls nestled in sleeping bags, eyes shut but smiling in sleep. These photos became a part of the case file, not as evidence of guilt, but as chilling reminders of what was lost. They told a story of a man who was once whole, and 3 children who trusted him with their entire world. The girls, Madison, age 9, Ella, 7, and Gracie, 5, were the kind of children that neighbors remembered vividly. They rode scooters down cracked sidewalks, drew chalk butterflies on driveways, and waved to passing mail trucks like it was a royal ceremony. Their laughter often echoed from the backyard of the small duplex where they lived with their mother. It was a place filled with mismatched furniture, secondhand toys, and the kind of worn love that tried its best to hold everything together despite court dates and financial strain. Travis visited every other weekend. When he picked the girls up, they ran to him like gravity didn't matter. He never missed a pickup. He brought coloring books, tiny fishing rods, and sometimes surprise pets. Once, a box turtle named Larry who now sat forgotten in a plastic container on the back porch. Every visit was a carefully planned adventure. Even when funds were tight, Travis made it feel magical. He took the girls to hidden waterfalls, built tents out of old blankets, and told stories around campfires that made them believe the stars above were listening. His camera caught it all. Framed smiles. Toothless grins. Ice cream dripping down elbows and sunburned noses. But as investigators poured through hundreds of images stored in his cloud, they noticed a shift. Subtle at first. The girls' eyes, once carefree, began to look more tired. Travis's own face aged rapidly within those pixels. In the earlier photos, he smiled without reservation. In the later ones, the smile remained but didn't reach his eyes. His posture became more guarded, the angles of his self-timed shots more precise, as if he were trying to capture not just a moment, but proof that he was still the father he claimed to be. In family court, photographs often serve as silent arguments. Travis brought them to hearings, printing them in glossy 8x10s, handing them to judges with trembling fingers. He believed they were evidence of stability, of connection. But family court doesn't always weigh emotion equally. His ex-wife, Megan, presented a different kind of documentation: emails, text messages, transcripts from therapy sessions that described erratic behavior and unprovoked outbursts. She claimed the man in the photos no longer existed. To outsiders, the Decker family was simply another casualty of divorce. Friends tried not to take sides, but the cracks were visible. Some noted that Travis became increasingly rigid about routines, insisting the girls follow strict schedules even during casual visits. Others recalled awkward moments where he snapped over minor things: spilled juice, a broken crayon, a moment of disobedience. His intentions seemed rooted in discipline, but something about his intensity unsettled those closest to him. The most recent family photo, taken 3 weeks before the tragedy, showed Travis and the girls in front of a rented cabin near Crescent Lake. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a chance to disconnect. The image showed all 4 of them wrapped in flannel, the morning sun casting a golden hue over their faces. At first glance, it looked perfect. But a closer look revealed the smallest girl, Gracie, holding her sister's hand tightly. Travis's expression was off, not quite angry, but distant, distracted, like someone preoccupied with a thought that refused to let go. Digital forensics revealed that this image, unlike previous ones, had been edited. Filters applied, lighting adjusted, shadows softened. It was as if he was trying to present an idealized version of a reality that no longer existed. As the investigation continued, those photos took on a darker meaning. Not just memories, but mirrors. Windows into a man unraveling while clinging to the only identity that gave his life meaning: father. The police began tracing his digital footprint, discovering more than just images. Travis maintained a private blog under a pseudonym, filled with essays about fatherhood, justice, and loss. Some entries were poetic, reflective. Others were angry, even delusional. One post, dated just 10 days before the girls' deaths, read, "If the world won't protect them, I will. I'll take them where the noise can't reach. Where custody orders don't apply. Where love isn't governed by lawyers in suits." Those words haunted every person who read them. They suggested not just intent, but belief. That Travis saw himself as both victim and savior, caught in a system that failed to see his desperation as dangerous. And maybe, in some fractured way, he believed what he was about to do was an act of mercy. The happy faces in the old photos could no longer be viewed as moments of joy. They became snapshots of the last days before the storm. The last smiles before the silence. To the public, they were heartbreaking. To the investigators, they were clues. And to Travis Decker, wherever he was, they were possibly the last proof he had that once, for a moment in time, everything had felt right. The investigation into Travis Decker's disappearance was no longer confined to forest trails and muddy creek beds. As the days passed with no sightings, authorities turned to the one place where people rarely vanish completely, the digital world. In a time where every tap, swipe, and click leaves a footprint, even ghosts struggle to stay hidden. Travis, for all his preparation and calculated behavior, had left behind fragments of himself across the internet, just enough for the investigators to piece together the disintegration of a man who had once appeared so grounded. His online presence was fragmented but active. He had multiple social media accounts, some obvious, others anonymous. On the surface, his public profiles painted a portrait of a loving father, posting wholesome weekend photos, inspirational quotes about fatherhood, and links to parenting articles. But beneath that layer existed a more obscure digital trail, burner email addresses, encrypted messaging apps, and participation in forums dedicated to family court reform, anti-government sentiments, and survivalist ideology. As detectives dug deeper, they found Travis wasn't just venting his frustrations online, he was building a digital echo chamber that amplified his fears and justified his paranoia. He had followed dozens of pages devoted to parental alienation, reading stories from other fathers who believed they had been stripped of their rights unfairly. Many of these groups shared a common thread: distrust of the legal system, disdain for family court judges, and a dangerous belief that taking matters into your own hands was not just understandable, but necessary. Travis commented under pseudonyms, often late at night, his tone shifting from pleading to obsessive. He quoted laws, challenged moderators, and eventually began posting cryptic warnings: "You'll all see what happens when they push too far," and "the only way to win is to leave the board entirely." Investigators traced a private forum he frequented, buried behind password walls and invitation-only links. There, Travis shared long posts detailing his frustrations with his ex-wife, accusing her of manipulation and turning the children against him. He described the girls as hostages of a broken system, language that made law enforcement uneasy. The most disturbing entry came 2 weeks before the incident, when he posted a manifesto-length rant under a thread titled "Final Plans." While vague, it spoke of escape, rebirth, and a return to nature where law cannot reach. The administrators later deleted the post, but not before another user captured screenshots and turned them over to the FBI. His search history was equally troubling. Over the course of 3 months, Travis had researched remote locations across the Pacific Northwest, cross-referencing terrain maps with cell tower ranges. He downloaded survival guides, studied primitive shelter construction, and saved offline copies of edible plant indexes. He even looked up the effects of cold exposure on children, an entry that investigators flagged as particularly chilling. It wasn't the curiosity of a hiker or a camper. It was the methodical planning of someone preparing for an event that would sever them from society. Meanwhile, GPS data extracted from his devices showed he had taken unannounced solo trips to wilderness areas weeks before the fatal weekend. These weren't casual drives. He logged mileage that led nowhere, stopped at obscure gas stations, and once spent several hours parked near an abandoned ranger station more than 40 miles from Arden Hill. Surveillance footage from those stops, where available, showed him alone, wearing heavy gear, eyes sunken, and movements deliberate. He wasn't running errands. He was rehearsing. Investigators also uncovered strange financial activity. In the months prior, Travis had begun slowly draining his savings account, $500 here, $300 there, transferred to prepaid debit cards. None of those cards were ever used after the incident. He purchased camping supplies, water filtration gear, a new hunting knife, and a satellite beacon. Oddly, he never activated the beacon. It remained in its box, unopened, discovered later beneath a tarp buried at one of his forest camp points. To the forensic analysts, it felt symbolic, like he knew he wouldn't need it, or had never intended to be found. His online shopping habits betrayed his state of mind. Among the camping gear were books on child psychology, trauma recovery, and grief processing. One book in particular stood out, a self-published guide titled "Leaving the System: A Father's Way Out," which described staged disappearances and wilderness faking techniques. It wasn't a bestseller, but in the right circles, it had a reputation as a manifesto for those looking to vanish with purpose. Travis left a 5-star review. As the digital trail unfolded, a picture emerged that had little resemblance to the man known by neighbors and friends. The Travis they knew had boundaries, responsibilities, and goals. The one behind the screen was unraveling. Not overnight, but slowly, methodically, and perhaps, inevitably. Each post, each search, each purchase pulled him further away from the version of himself that had once played dress-up with his daughters and stayed up late baking birthday cakes from scratch. To law enforcement, it became clear that Travis Decker hadn't snapped in a single moment of madness. He had been preparing for months. He didn't vanish in panic, he vanished with intention. Every breadcrumb he left behind was part of a larger, darker pattern, one that suggested he had either orchestrated the ultimate disappearance or had followed through with something far more irreversible. And somewhere, buried in the data he thought he had hidden, lay the question no one could answer: was this the act of a broken father running from a world that failed him, or the carefully staged erasure of a man who no longer cared who was left behind? In reconstructing the final moments of the Decker girls' lives, investigators faced the uncomfortable challenge of separating speculation from fact. So much of what happened during those final hours remained shrouded in silence, lost in the density of the wilderness and the absence of eyewitnesses. Yet certain elements were undeniable: digital timestamps, physical evidence, and the haunting, meticulous timeline assembled from surveillance, geolocation data, and forensic science. The last confirmed sighting of Madison, Ella, and Gracie was at a roadside convenience store just off Route 14, less than 6 miles from the Pine Ridge campground. Security footage placed them there shortly after 8:30 a.m. on the Saturday of the holiday weekend. They appeared alert, calm, and unaware of anything unusual. Madison held a slushy cup, while Ella and Gracie trailed behind their father with small packs slung over their shoulders. Travis paid in cash. No one else seemed to be with them. Receipts and surveillance confirmed Travis purchased water, protein bars, a small pack of AA batteries, and a disposable camera. For investigators, the latter item was of particular interest. The camera was recovered days later near the eastern bend of the forest trail, partially buried in damp leaves. When developed, it revealed 12 images, mostly of wooded paths, a campfire, and a partially pitched tent. But the final photo, a blurry, dim shot taken in low light, showed a makeshift shelter with 3 small figures curled under a tarp. The timestamp placed the image less than 12 hours before their estimated time of death. Autopsy reports indicated that none of the children had suffered trauma. Toxicology revealed no presence of drugs, sedatives, or poisons. Hypothermia was listed as the primary cause, likely due to prolonged exposure during an unexpected cold snap that dropped nighttime temperatures below freezing. Investigators noted the presence of several heat packs in the area, some activated, others unused, suggesting efforts were made to keep the children warm. Still, their light clothing and inadequate shelter couldn't hold back the elements. What made their deaths more confounding was the absence of their father. There were no adult footprints found near the final resting site, no clothing or blood trace linked to Travis. Some believed he had been with them and fled just before the storm worsened. Others theorized he had left the girls alone intentionally, whether out of delusion or desperation, and vanished long before their final hours unfolded. But his complete absence from the death scene continued to raise the unsettling possibility that he had orchestrated something else, something far more deliberate. Witnesses later recalled hearing faint voices near a trail crossing on the night of the cold snap, possibly a man and children, one crying softly, another asking for "Mama." No one investigated at the time. Such sounds were common in family campgrounds. Only in retrospect did they take on a different meaning. Thermal drones deployed after the disappearance picked up a heat signature that evening near the ravine, but the signal was lost shortly after. When the team reached that location, they found disturbed underbrush, a pile of snack wrappers, and 2 water bottles. A forensic pathologist noted that the girls' postures at the scene indicated they may have been told to stay still or rest. There were no signs of struggle. Their hands were clean. Their faces bore no expression of fear. This led some experts to hypothesize that they died believing everything was fine, that they would be rescued soon, that their father had simply gone to get help. To think that their final moments were filled not with panic, but trust, made the case all the more devastating. Their backpacks were found beside them, still zipped. Inside were familiar comforts: a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Wiggles, a cracked handheld game console, a pink notebook with drawings of unicorns and stars. Gracie's favorite bracelet, a plastic beaded one she insisted on wearing daily, was wrapped tightly around her wrist. The girls hadn't been in survival mode. They had been in waiting mode. Waiting for their dad to return. Waiting to go home. A small fire pit nearby suggested an attempt to maintain warmth, but no evidence of a prolonged fire was present. The woodpile was barely touched. A single matchbook was found, soaked and unused. This, investigators theorized, indicated that either Travis didn't stay long enough to manage the fire or he never planned to maintain it. His own gear, including a lightweight sleeping bag and a small propane stove, were later found 3 miles away at a secondary shelter, fully intact and dry beneath a camouflage tarp. Forensic analysis of his camp showed he had stayed there overnight, likely alone. The items present were consistent with one adult, not 4 people. No children's belongings were found at the second site. The discovery fueled one of the darkest theories of the investigation, that Travis separated himself from the girls long before their deaths, perhaps believing it was a form of protection, or punishment, or something no one could yet understand. In the days following the release of the autopsy and forensic findings, public sentiment shifted. While Travis had once been viewed as a grieving father or missing person, more began to see him as responsible, by negligence, by planning, or both. The tragedy had ceased to be a mystery and become a reckoning. The unanswered question that echoed across newsrooms, podcast episodes, and social media posts was no longer, where is he, but, why did he leave them? And yet, as much as the world condemned, mourned, or speculated, the one thing that could not be ignored was the silence of 3 small girls, tucked beneath a nylon tarp, who had trusted their father until their final breath. By the time search crews discovered the bodies of the Decker girls, Travis Decker had already become a national mystery. Despite exhaustive manhunts, forensic sweeps, and days of drone surveillance, there was no sign of him, no body, no footprints beyond a certain point, no digital ping, not even a trail of belongings that could confirm his fate. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. What should have been a straightforward resolution to a tragic custody case had instead evolved into one of the most perplexing disappearances in recent memory. The deeper the investigators looked, the more elusive Travis became. The most baffling detail remained the sheer lack of physical evidence indicating where Travis had gone. Wildlife trackers, military-grade infrared drones, and K9 units combed through 30 square miles of wilderness, yet every possible lead terminated at the site of the second shelter. The ground around it bore his weight, confirmed by bootprint analysis. DNA swabs from the gear matched his. The small propane stove had been recently used. His scent was picked up by dogs, but abruptly disappeared at the edge of a ravine, where the trail turned to rock and water. A team of geologists and forensic terrain analysts reviewed the land structure to determine whether Travis could have fallen into a crevice or been swept away by the shallow current that flowed into the nearby river. But no signs of a fall or injury were found. The current wasn't strong enough to carry a body far, especially not one with a pack as heavy as Travis's. Dams downstream were checked. Cadaver dogs were dispatched. No remains surfaced. What remained was a confounding void, marked only by the absence of what should have been inevitable. Authorities began to explore more unconventional theories. Could Travis have staged his death and escaped? It was a chilling but increasingly plausible possibility. Given the months of planning uncovered in his digital footprint, research into vanishing, off-grid survival, and anti-surveillance techniques, experts started to question whether Travis had prepared not just to survive in the woods but to disappear entirely. His purchases leading up to the trip included signal-blocking pouches, military-grade navigation tools, and even prepaid SIM cards registered to dummy identities. Several locals later reported a strange figure matching his description seen walking alone days before the search was concentrated. One sighting came from a gas station attendant 2 counties over, who remembered a tall man with a large hiking backpack paying in cash and keeping his head low beneath a hood. While the report couldn't be confirmed, it added fuel to the belief that Travis may have left the area long before the search had even begun in earnest. The FBI expanded the investigation beyond the local jurisdiction. Border checkpoints were alerted. Rural airports were notified. Surveillance was pulled from bus terminals and train stations as far as 200 miles away. Still, no confirmed trace of Travis Decker was found. He didn't use credit cards. He didn't leave a digital fingerprint. No relatives received calls. No friends were visited. Every trail went cold, every theory led to speculation without proof. It was as if he had been swallowed by the landscape, or had erased himself from it entirely. Psychological profilers assigned to the case offered grim theories about his state of mind. Some believed Travis had never planned to live past the event, and his body simply hadn't been discovered yet, lost to nature or concealed by his own hand. Others argued that his escape had always been part of the plan. Not as a way to flee justice, but as a final act of defiance against a system he believed had broken him. Disappearing wasn't just about freedom. It was about control. About removing himself from a narrative that had left him powerless. What most disturbed investigators was the meticulous silence that followed. No manifesto was found. No final message. No confession, suicide note, or digital legacy. For a man who had been so vocal online, so desperate to be heard in forums and comment sections, his real-world exit was devoid of closure. It didn't feel accidental. It felt intentional. As though he had prepared himself not just for escape, but for complete erasure. Weeks turned to months. Public interest surged and waned, spiking whenever new information surfaced, each time a false lead, a mistaken sighting, or an anonymous tip that unraveled within hours. The FBI released a digitally aged photograph of what Travis might look like with a shaved beard and dyed hair. Billboards went up in border states. A $100,000 reward was offered. But nothing came of it. He had vanished more effectively than criminals with years of experience in evasion. And he'd done it alone. Eventually, conspiracy theories began to circulate. Some believed he had help, members of an underground fathers' rights group, or survivalists who sympathized with his cause. Others believed he died in the woods and his body would eventually surface. But the most disturbing theory, the one that lingered without being spoken too loudly, was that Travis hadn't fled or died. He was watching. Listening. That he had succeeded in creating the perfect vanishing act and was now living under a new name, a new face, somewhere beyond the edges of the grid. No one could say for sure. But what haunted everyone, from law enforcement to the families affected, was the fact that in the absence of answers, in the vacuum Travis left behind, there was no justice. No reckoning. No redemption. Only silence. And in that silence, a single horrifying truth remained: he might have planned everything right down to his disappearance, and gotten away with it. As media outlets began piecing together the fragments of Travis Decker's story, public sentiment fractured. What began as widespread sympathy toward a grieving father and his missing daughters quickly curdled into collective outrage once the girls were found dead, and their father missing. The nation had followed the case with invested hearts, only to be left reeling at the grim conclusion. Overnight, the narrative shifted. Travis was no longer seen as a desperate parent caught in a tragic spiral. He was viewed as a fugitive, a child killer, a man who weaponized grief and used fatherhood as a shield for something far more sinister. Social media erupted with fury. Hashtags like #Justice for the Decker Girls, #FindTravisDecker, and #FatherOrMonster trended for weeks. Online forums that once debated family court injustices turned on their former ally, scrubbing old posts and disavowing Travis's actions. Comment sections were filled with heartbreak, anger, and disbelief. The brutality of the outcome and the calculated disappearance hit a nerve across demographics. Parents, especially, responded with visceral emotion, describing sleepless nights, images they couldn't shake, and an overwhelming desire for answers that never came. True crime podcasts and YouTube creators flooded the internet with theories, timelines, and deep dives. Some offered analysis and empathy, others leaned into sensationalism. Within a week, Travis's name became a fixture in the top 10 trending Google searches in the US. Long threads unraveled every digital trace of his life, speculating about his upbringing, his beliefs, even his parenting style. Armchair detectives tore through property records, analyzed drone footage frame by frame, and cross-referenced posts from obscure forums. People wanted not just justice, but understanding. What could drive a man to do something so irreversible, so deliberate? But amid the outrage, another quieter group emerged, defenders of Travis, who claimed the tragedy was proof of a broken system that pushed a father to the edge. They argued that family courts had failed him, that his desperation had been ignored, that society hadn't taken his warning seriously. They didn't excuse his actions, but they insisted on seeing him as a casualty of flawed institutions. This split in public opinion ignited further debate and backlash. News commentators clashed on air. Talk show panels dissolved into heated arguments. The question hung in the air like smoke: was Travis Decker a villain, or a symptom? Mainstream news networks scrambled to control the tone of their coverage. Initial segments that had portrayed him as a loving father were quickly retracted or re-edited. Networks issued clarifications, and reporters who had once interviewed family members of Travis now returned for follow-ups, pressing them with questions that walked a line between journalism and judgment. The Decker family itself was thrust into an unwanted spotlight, with Travis's siblings and elderly parents facing media pressure, doxing threats, and public harassment. In Arden Hill, the small town that had once known the Decker family as just another household with shared custody weekends and PDA meetings, a different kind of fallout took place. The local school district organized grief counseling. A memorial garden was erected at the elementary school where Ella and Gracie once attended. Teachers remembered their drawings. Friends left flowers. And yet, whispers filled grocery stores and church parking lots. Who had known what? Had there been signs? Why didn't anyone do more? The backlash extended to the legal system as well. The judge who presided over Travis's custody case received death threats. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, some demanding accountability for ignoring warning signs, others claiming that such tragedies would continue until the system began recognizing the emotional toll of parental separation on fathers. Heated town halls followed. Lawmakers promised reviews. Petitions circulated to implement more thorough psychological evaluations during contentious custody battles. Some states saw a renewed call for reform in how custody disputes were handled, striking a tense balance between protecting parental rights and safeguarding children's welfare. Advocates for domestic violence prevention warned against romanticizing or martyring figures like Travis Decker. They stressed that manipulation and control often hide beneath the veneer of victimhood. To many, Travis wasn't a father broken by the system, he was a man who chose to punish his children's mother in the most horrific way imaginable. Meanwhile, online marketplaces and third-party retailers faced criticism for allowing survivalist content and materials that Travis had used in his planning. A congressional subcommittee quietly began inquiries into the accessibility of materials promoting extreme anti-government ideologies, particularly within online communities claiming to support fathers' rights. Law enforcement agencies were urged to monitor high-risk family court cases with more precision and proactive mental health assessments. Documentary crews lined up for interviews. Film rights were optioned. The tragedy, like many before it, was being monetized, packaged, and consumed. But for many, the anger hadn't lessened. It had metastasized. Because Travis had stolen something far more painful than the lives of 3 innocent girls, he had stolen closure. He had denied the public, the courts, and his own family a resolution. There was no trial, no sentence, no apology. And in that vacuum, the backlash only grew louder. People don't grieve well in silence. They need names. They need someone to blame. And Travis Decker, missing or dead, had become the perfect villain, a ghost that refused to be buried, a wound that refused to close. In the weeks following the recovery of her daughter's bodies and the disappearance of her ex-husband, Lauren Mitchell became the face of a movement she never asked for. Media outlets called her the mother of the tragedy, but headlines could not capture the full weight of her grief, nor the storm she now found herself navigating. With the funeral barely behind her and no answers about Travis's whereabouts, she was forced to transform overnight, from mourning parent to public advocate, legal warrior, and reluctant symbol of resilience. Initially, Lauren remained silent. Her attorney fielded questions, and statements were issued only through official channels. The online world interpreted her silence in different ways, some saw it as strength, others called it calculated. As internet debates raged over custody dynamics, gender bias, and the justice system, Lauren bore the brunt of scrutiny from all sides. In forums, she was alternately portrayed as the heartbroken mother, the scapegoat, and the villain. Strangers dissected her parenting, her divorce filings, even her body language in old courtroom footage. But as the noise grew louder, so did her resolve. Lauren emerged with clarity, channeling her loss into a focused demand for accountability. In her first public interview, she delivered a calm but direct message. This wasn't just about her daughters. It was about a system that failed them. She pointed to the court's unwillingness to act on multiple red flags, Travis's erratic behavior, ignored emails, missed counseling appointments, and even a letter she had submitted weeks before the trip, expressing fears that something was not right. The interview went viral. It was shared by advocacy groups, reposted across parenting platforms, and aired nationally. Lauren's poise and specificity struck a chord, and suddenly, the national conversation shifted again. Public outrage, once broadly directed at the situation as a whole, began zeroing in on the systemic breakdowns that had allowed a dangerous parent to maintain access to vulnerable children. Lauren launched a foundation in her daughters' names, focused on family court reform, child safety, and mental health screenings in high-conflict custody battles. Within a month, her foundation had raised over $1.2 million. She met with lawmakers in her state and pushed for legislation nicknamed Ella's Law, which proposed mandatory psychological risk assessments during custody disputes involving prior warnings or parental mental health flags. As the movement gained momentum, so did the threats. Lauren's advocacy drew the ire of online fringe groups who had once idolized Travis as a martyr. Anonymous accounts accused her of manipulating the media, of turning her tragedy into a political platform. Some accused her of fabricating or exaggerating evidence. Others, more insidious, implied she was somehow responsible for what happened, repeating rhetoric from men's rights circles that painted women as vindictive manipulators. Law enforcement assigned her temporary protection after several credible threats. Her personal address was leaked online. At one point, she had to relocate temporarily with her remaining family to ensure their safety. But none of it deterred her. She returned to the courthouse not as a litigant, but as a witness for upcoming civil proceedings and federal reviews into judicial misconduct. She testified in front of a closed committee about the dozens of times she tried to raise alarm over Travis's deteriorating state of mind. Her timeline was corroborated by emails, school counselor reports, and even text messages from Travis himself, messages once dismissed as emotional venting, now seen through a lens of tragic hindsight. Despite these efforts, Lauren refused to let her fight become one of revenge. She consistently reiterated that her advocacy wasn't about punishing the past, it was about preventing the future. If even one child can be protected because someone paused and took a warning sign seriously, she said in another televised statement, then my girls didn't die for nothing. Mental health professionals began referencing the case in lectures and journals, calling it a turning point in how parental mental illness is handled in family court. Legal scholars cited it as an example of emotional blind spots in judicial discretion. Across the country, judges were urged to undergo trauma-informed training. Lawyers re-examined how they approached high-risk custody cases. Lauren's tragedy had ignited a slow but steady transformation in the legal landscape. She continued working behind the scenes, reviewing bills, attending panel discussions, consulting with other grieving families. Though she rejected the label of hero, the public often framed her as exactly that. A mother who refused to disappear into the shadow of her loss. A mother who had every reason to retreat, but chose instead to fight back with reason, data, and grace. Still, grief remained an ever-present companion. The home she once shared with her daughters sat untouched, a time capsule of bedtime routines and art projects never finished. In interviews, Lauren admitted she didn't know how to move forward, only that she had to. Because there was work to be done. Because she was the only one left to tell their story. And so, while Travis Decker remained a ghost, a face on a wanted poster, a name in a file, Lauren Mitchell became the living, breathing force that refused to let silence win. The truth had been buried once. She would not let it happen again. As investigators continued chasing dead ends in the physical world, a new front emerged in the search for Travis Decker, the digital trail. Although Travis had taken extraordinary steps to obscure his movements, leaving behind no phone, turning off GPS, and operating strictly in cash, the internet began revealing a more calculated portrait of a man who had long been preparing for the day everything would fall apart. What once looked like emotional instability was beginning to resemble a cold, methodical unraveling. Federal agents secured warrants to comb through Travis's devices, cloud storage, and online activity. What they discovered was a chilling trove of data, thousands of bookmarked articles, forum threads, survivalist manuals, and DIY guides detailing how to live off-grid. But beyond the generic material were posts, anonymous, encrypted, and carefully written, that investigators believed were authored by Travis himself. They found detailed plans disguised as general discussions, with just enough plausible deniability to avoid detection at the time. But in hindsight, the intent became impossible to ignore. On one encrypted messaging board, a user operating under the pseudonym End of the Path had shared a hypothetical strategy eerily similar to Travis's eventual actions. The user described a scenario involving a custody battle, children caught in the middle, and a decision to exit the system by disappearing into deep terrain. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion. It wasn't a rant, it was a blueprint. And while the forum didn't require email verification, metadata pointed investigators to a VPN known to be used by Travis months earlier. The deeper analysts went, the more it became clear, Travis didn't break, he built. Piece by piece, post by post, he constructed a philosophy centered on vanishing. His browser history was flooded with searches like, how to erase identity legally, best states to disappear, and how to live with no paper trail. He studied disappearances that had never been solved, watched hours of documentaries on fugitives, and interacted with accounts that encouraged self-erasure in the face of perceived injustice. More disturbingly, agents uncovered a series of drafted emails never sent, written in a tone both bitter and resolved. Some were addressed to Lauren, others to their daughters. Each contained fragments of justification, claims that the court had failed him, that society punished fathers for loving too much, that the world would one day understand why he had to protect his girls. None of them accepted blame. None acknowledged the violence of what he had done. It was a digital echo of a mind that had long since shifted into another moral framework. Social media accounts under Travis's real name showed little, carefully curated vacation photos, a few likes on parenting articles, and benign interactions with coworkers. But the shadow presence he maintained elsewhere painted the truer picture. Investigators traced him to several private groups focused on sovereign fatherhood and anti-government ideologies. These weren't simply support forums for frustrated parents, They were echo chambers that validated extreme decisions, fostering narratives that cast family courts as corrupt, mothers as enemies, and children as property. In one forum, Travis had engaged in long debates over the ethical boundaries of final solutions in custody battles. Using the alias Truth Before Peace, he posted a now-deleted comment: "If the world won't give you justice, sometimes you have to take it. You don't let the system bury your soul while your children are raised by strangers." It was flagged at the time but not reported. Now, it read like a manifesto in miniature. Forensic tech teams reconstructed his deleted files, piecing together what amounted to a digital diary, audio logs, scattered notes, even encrypted checklists. Each file represented another piece of a puzzle everyone hoped never had to be solved. The dates stretched back nearly 2 years, long before his final custody appeal. Travis hadn't snapped; he had been building toward this for a very long time. Further analysis revealed that he had downloaded a series of offline maps covering remote wilderness areas in multiple states, far beyond where his disappearance occurred. He had researched abandoned cabins, water purification techniques, and even built a rudimentary code for communicating with people on the outside without detection. Investigators feared that Travis may not only have survived, but was still communicating with others under false identities. A traceable email never surfaced, but logs hinted that burner accounts had been used briefly and then wiped clean. Cybersecurity experts issued warnings about the rise of what they called digital vanishers, individuals who use technology not to connect, but to disappear. Travis Decker, they argued, could be the most extreme case to date. A man who used the same tools meant to keep people safe, cloud backups, encryption, anonymous browsing, to escape justice entirely. The implications were unsettling. Law enforcement agencies across state lines began revisiting cold cases involving missing parents and children. Algorithms were rewritten to flag suspicious patterns in future custody cases. But the reality remained grim. Travis had left behind no digital tripwire. He had engineered his disappearance with the precision of someone who no longer believed in systems, accountability, or redemption. What haunted investigators most was not what he had written, but what he hadn't. No final confession. No video message. No goodbye. The silence wasn't just absence, it was strategy. And in the digital void he left behind, only one thing became clear: Travis Decker had weaponized the modern world to make himself vanish. And so far, he had succeeded. As weeks turned to months, the search for Travis Decker evolved from an urgent pursuit into one of the most sophisticated, prolonged manhunts in recent U.S. criminal history. At first, local authorities assumed he might have taken his own life after committing the unthinkable. The area where the girls were found was combed by divers, drones, and search dogs. No body turned up. No blood, no clothing, no physical evidence that he'd perished nearby. That assumption began to collapse under the weight of one undeniable truth: Travis hadn't vanished in panic. He had disappeared with purpose. The U.S. Marshals Service took over primary responsibility for the case once federal charges were filed. Their fugitive task force applied the same methods used to locate domestic terrorists and cartel operatives. But even with advanced surveillance techniques and access to nationwide databases, they hit wall after wall. Every potential sighting resulted in nothing. Surveillance footage from rural gas stations, hunting cabins, and remote trailheads came up inconclusive or irrelevant. It became clear that Travis had not only planned his escape route meticulously, he had chosen places to blend in, move invisibly, or vanish outright. One of the most frustrating elements for authorities was his complete absence from any surveillance ecosystem. He had abandoned the usual tells: no ATM usage, no credit card trails, no license plate readers triggering alerts, and no digital check-ins of any kind. Border Patrol agencies flagged him early, but his name never pinged at a crossing. Facial recognition scans at airports and bus terminals yielded nothing. Either he had altered his appearance dramatically, or he was hiding somewhere where technology couldn't reach. Investigators then looked at Travis's extended background. His childhood friends. Former employers. Places he had traveled to years ago. They interviewed dozens of people who described him as intelligent, quietly intense, and detail-oriented. Some recalled his early interest in military survival books. One college friend remembered Travis once talking about how disappearing was just a matter of patience, terrain, and mindset. No one had taken the comment seriously at the time. Now it sounded prophetic. Survivalist communities across the country were alerted. Many denied having ever harbored him. A few seemed sympathetic, even admiring. One Montana-based group posted anonymously on encrypted forums praising Travis's dedication to sovereignty, calling him a free father who broke the chain. It was never confirmed if he was actually among them, but the language suggested a cultural undercurrent that refused to see him as a criminal, even after everything that happened. A separate theory began to take root in law enforcement circles, that Travis may have fled abroad. He'd traveled internationally in his 20s, and passport records showed a few gaps in time. While there was no evidence he left the country after the murders, certain offshore locations with weak extradition agreements became topics of interest. Investigators focused on American expat communities in parts of South America, Southeast Asia, and even the Balkans. Anonymous tips poured in from people claiming to have seen him working under a different name in construction sites, farms, or port towns. Every lead collapsed under scrutiny. The FBI began consulting experts in behavioral profiling. Their conclusion was sobering: Travis was the kind of fugitive who would avoid all contact with anyone from his past. He was capable of adapting entirely to a new life, adopting a false identity, and never speaking a word about where he came from or what he had done. He would know how to bury himself in unregulated labor markets, how to find communities that didn't ask questions, and how to exploit cracks in social and legal infrastructure. In short, he was not simply hiding, he had become someone else entirely. As frustration grew, the reward for information leading to his capture rose exponentially. From $25,000 to $100,000, and eventually $500,000, funded partially by private donors and victim advocacy groups. Billboards were erected across the Midwest, Pacific Northwest, and Appalachian regions, anywhere with dense wilderness, survivalist enclaves, or loose border routes. The case became a fixture on America's most wanted lists. His face, once seen smiling beside his daughters in a faded vacation photo, became a symbol of the country's most haunting unanswered question. Still, no credible sighting was ever verified. The possibility that Travis had perished in some remote wilderness without a trace still lingered, but there was no closure. No proof. No body. Nothing to confirm or disprove any outcome. Authorities kept the case open and active, but the momentum slowed. Budgets shifted. Teams were reassigned. Eventually, the Decker file went cold, but never closed. For the public, his name became folklore. Whispers of a ghost father who vanished after the darkest act. Urban legends formed. Online forums kept the story alive with amateur sleuths dissecting every shred of new information. Books were written. A streaming documentary series was produced, reawakening interest but offering no new leads. He became less of a person and more of a question: how can someone just disappear? Behind closed doors, law enforcement knew the truth. Travis Decker hadn't vanished because of luck. He had disappeared because he wanted to, and because he had the knowledge, patience, and willpower to do it. The hunt continued, quietly and relentlessly. Because as long as there was no body and no answer, Travis Decker wasn't dead. He was just waiting to be found. As the case continued to captivate the nation, public sentiment fractured into two sharply divided camps. On one side stood the grieving supporters of Lauren Mitchell and her daughters, who viewed Travis Decker's disappearance not as a mystery but as a grotesque injustice still unresolved. For them, the absence of closure was a continued act of violence, proof that the system not only failed to protect the children but also failed to bring their killer to justice. They organized vigils, fundraisers, and memorials, amplifying Lauren's voice as she pushed for reform and awareness. To these supporters, Travis was a cold-blooded murderer who exploited legal loopholes, technology, and cultural biases to vanish after committing the unthinkable. On the other side, however, an unsettling narrative began to build, particularly online. In forums and fringe platforms, Travis was reframed, not as a killer, but as a father pushed to the edge by a biased court system. This was the narrative that gained traction among certain men's rights activists, radicalized parental alienation groups, and anti-government survivalist communities. They labeled Travis a martyr, someone who had been failed by every institution that was supposed to protect him as a father. They denied or downplayed his actions. They twisted facts, questioned Lauren's motives, and even suggested the deaths were either accidents or staged altogether. The conspiracy theories grew more bizarre with time, but they fed into an already polarized environment in which truth was shaped by belief, not evidence. The internet became the primary battleground. YouTube creators, podcast hosts, and amateur commentators all weighed in. Some used the case to highlight flaws in family court proceedings, others pushed dangerous misinformation and outright lies. Influencers used the story for engagement, dissecting Travis's supposed motives, analyzing his digital footprint, and debating whether he was a villain or victim. For the grieving families, these discussions were salt in a gaping wound, turning tragedy into spectacle. More troubling were the online campaigns that weaponized the case. Bots and troll farms, often with unclear origins, flooded social media with posts that spread disinformation, targeted Lauren, and glorified Travis. Investigators later confirmed that some of the most shared posts about Lauren being vindictive or mentally unstable originated from coordinated accounts with no known human operator. These digital campaigns were not just harmful, they were designed to undermine trust in facts altogether. This growing culture of misinformation complicated the legal and emotional landscape. Several lawmakers who had initially expressed support for Ella's law began to hesitate, citing the need to hear both sides. Talk radio hosts invited controversial guests who denied the confirmed details of the case, framing the narrative as a larger cultural war between parental rights and government overreach. The truth of what happened was no longer just obscured, it was under active assault. At the same time, real-world consequences began to emerge. Judges who had ruled on the Decker custody case received threats. Child psychologists who testified on behalf of Lauren were doxxed. One courthouse in Michigan reported a spike in custody disputes where parents cited the Decker precedent in filings, arguing that courts were unfairly biased against fathers. A growing number of parents, mothers and fathers alike, expressed fear that their custody battles might spiral into similar tragedies. Law enforcement agencies had to adjust their tactics. Media briefings were scaled back to prevent misinterpretation. The marshals tightened the release of information regarding Travis's last known movements. Internal memos emphasized caution in how agents discussed the case in public settings, warning that casual statements could be twisted into viral content. Even seasoned officers found themselves walking a line between transparency and damage control. For trauma counselors, the ripple effects were overwhelming. Parents embroiled in custody disputes began expressing increased anxiety, often referencing the Decker case in sessions. Some worried about their safety. Others feared being falsely accused or losing their children. The tragedy had altered the national psyche, especially among families navigating the already volatile terrain of divorce, custody, and legal conflict. Media scholars began analyzing the case as a reflection of a broader societal problem, the erosion of consensus reality. With so many competing versions of the truth, some grounded in fact, others completely fabricated, the story of Travis Decker became less about what happened, and more about what people chose to believe. It became a case study in how information warfare can infect even the most personal tragedies. Meanwhile, the silence from Travis himself only fueled the divide. Had he been found, dead or alive, the nation might have arrived at some semblance of resolution. But his absence became fertile ground for projection, mythologizing, and revisionism. Every day he remained missing was another day his story could be shaped by agendas, algorithms, and emotional biases. The tragedy had stopped being a private matter long ago. It had become cultural currency, proof of whatever someone needed it to be. For reform advocates, it underscored the dire need to overhaul family law. For extremists, it became a rallying cry against perceived oppression. And for the vast majority caught in the middle, it was a cautionary tale with no satisfying ending, only questions that multiplied with time. The public divide was no longer just about guilt or innocence, it was about what kind of society America was becoming. One where fact could be drowned by noise. One where grief could be hijacked by ideology. One where even the most horrific crimes could be twisted into symbols for narratives that had nothing to do with justice. Long after the search parties disbanded and the media coverage dulled into intermittent retrospectives, the name Travis Decker continued to haunt every institution it touched, courts, law enforcement, families, and digital spaces alike. His case became more than a story about a missing man or the unspeakable deaths of 2 children, it became a mirror reflecting the most uncomfortable failures in American society. The lasting legacy wasn't just that he disappeared, it was how easily he fractured the systems meant to contain him and how deeply his act reverberated in the lives left behind. In the legal world, the case triggered waves of scrutiny. Civil rights organizations, family law experts, and lawmakers found themselves entrenched in bitter debate. Ella's law, initially proposed as a straightforward reform to prioritize child safety over shared custody, became mired in legal challenges and political gridlock. Advocates argued that had the law been in place earlier, family court judges would have had a stronger mandate to consider behavioral red flags, mental health history, and coercive control, especially in high-conflict custody disputes. Opponents, however, warned of potential misuse. They claimed the law could be weaponized to limit parental rights unfairly, especially against fathers. The result was a weakened version of the bill, passed with amendments that critics said stripped it of its effectiveness. Still, it set a precedent, forcing a nationwide re-examination of custody risk assessments. Some states began mandating additional training for judges on recognizing psychological abuse and the warning signs of parental extremism. Psychological experts took a different angle. For them, the Decker case exposed a deeper, more elusive danger, the phenomenon of the functional radical. Travis had not exhibited the traits traditionally associated with violent offenders. He was educated, employed, polite, and quiet. He passed background checks. He showed up to court in a suit. But underneath, he had been harboring a growing ideology of victimhood and vengeance, nurtured by years of online radicalization and perceived systemic betrayal. Mental health professionals began calling for new diagnostic tools and language to describe individuals who do not outwardly display instability but are mentally rehearsing violent outcomes for years. The idea of masked dissent, a gradual psychological shift hidden behind high-functioning behaviors, gained traction. It forced therapists, attorneys, and social workers to consider the emotional lives of parents in conflict in a more nuanced, multidimensional way. In academic spaces, the case was studied as a sociology lesson in modern alienation. Professors wrote papers dissecting how Travis's worldview was shaped not just by personal grievance, but by an online ecosystem that valorized his anger. They explored how algorithms had funneled him into echo chambers where parental disempowerment narratives were blended with anti-government and survivalist ideologies. His actions, while heinous, were not born in a vacuum. They were shaped by an environment increasingly designed to radicalize. In parenting communities, the legacy left scars that still haven't healed. Mothers in contested custody battles began installing security cameras in their homes. Some carried restraining orders with them at all times, fearing escalation. Fathers, too, faced new suspicion. Those with strong but legitimate frustrations over court rulings found themselves lumped in with extremists and vigilantes. This erosion of trust began to shift the tone of family court proceedings, with more judges requiring psychological evaluations, more frequent supervised visits, and stricter controls on communication between parties. For the two families at the center of the tragedy, Lauren Mitchell's and Travis Decker's, the legacy was more intimate and devastating. Lauren became a reluctant public figure, attending panels, participating in advocacy groups, and giving carefully controlled interviews. Despite the passage of time, she never publicly remarried, never moved far from the community where her daughters were buried, and rarely spoke about Travis by name. For her, healing was not a destination but a continuous process, shadowed by what-ifs. Travis's parents, initially silent, eventually gave one televised interview in which they condemned the actions taken by their son while also criticizing the family court system for what they described as systemic blindness to signs of mental strain. They had lost contact with him in the months before the tragedy but admitted to seeing behavioral changes that they had dismissed as stress. The interview sparked both sympathy and outrage, reigniting the debate over parental accountability in adult children's crimes. Years later, the case was still referenced in legislation, documentaries, college courses, and even detective training programs. It had become one of those rare stories that permanently altered how institutions operated. Law schools taught it as a case study in the limits of civil court protections. Law enforcement training used it to highlight the importance of threat assessment outside of traditional criminal profiling. Therapists cited it in workshops about hidden rage, nonviolent red flags, and the psychological toll of prolonged custody conflict. And in quiet homes across the country, the story lingered in subtler ways. Parents watched each other more closely. Judges questioned a little more deeply. Social workers requested more evaluations. The idea that someone could appear stable, reasonable, even loving, yet harbor the capacity for destruction reshaped how risk was assessed. The legacy of Travis Decker was not just in what he did, but in how thoroughly he exposed the blind spots of an entire system. His actions forced institutions to confront hard truths they had long ignored. The tragedy didn't end with his disappearance. Its aftershocks rippled through policy, psychology, and public consciousness. And even now, with his whereabouts unknown and justice unfulfilled, his name remained a grim reminder. Sometimes, the most dangerous individuals are not the ones who raise alarms, but the ones who never do. Years after Travis Decker vanished without a trace, his case took on a second life, no longer just a real-world tragedy, but a cold case preserved in the strange, eternal vaults of the internet. Websites, Reddit threads, podcasts, and long-form YouTube essays kept his name circulating, dissecting his motives, whereabouts, and digital footprints. While law enforcement resources dwindled, the digital world refused to let him fade away. And in that relentless online scrutiny, a new kind of investigation began, one conducted not by detectives or federal agents, but by digital sleuths, armchair criminologists, and obsessed truth-seekers who had never let the case go cold in their minds. Dozens of open-source investigation communities picked up the Decker story, approaching it with meticulous obsession. People created detailed timelines, mapped out his last verified movements, cataloged obscure sightings, and even attempted to reverse engineer his escape plan based on known trails, national forests, and areas with limited surveillance infrastructure. Others combed through missing persons databases in other states, attempting to match unidentified bodies with his description. They ran facial recognition comparisons on obituaries and background actors in foreign media footage. Some even monitored online survivalist forums for linguistic patterns that resembled Travis's writing style from archived social media posts. The digital footprint he had worked so hard to erase became the central focus. Despite deleting accounts, purging photos, and going dark on all major platforms, forensic tech users started recovering cached images, IP metadata, and usernames tied to old forum posts. A few Reddit investigators claimed they had found a burner account he may have used years before the murders, under which he had discussed the legal system, child custody, and rural off-grid living in suspiciously emotional and defensive language. Though unconfirmed, the similarities were enough to spark months of analysis and theory videos. What made the digital investigation even more compelling and disturbing was the increasing suspicion that Travis may have been watching from the shadows. Several anonymous accounts had posted strange comments on YouTube documentaries about the case, defending Travis in chillingly personal terms or correcting facts no one but someone close to the case should know. While these could easily have been hoaxes or trolls, they reinvigorated suspicion that Travis might still be lurking in digital anonymity, quietly feeding narratives, manipulating perception, and monitoring how the world remembered him. Law enforcement took some of these developments seriously, quietly opening communication with key online researchers. The FBI and U.S. Marshals began cross-referencing findings from the most respected digital sleuthing communities with internal data. In one instance, a group of civilian investigators flagged an email address connected to a rural job application in Alaska that bore a slight resemblance to Travis's writing cadence and alias history. Though the lead fizzled out, it showed how the line between official investigation and public obsession had blurred beyond recognition. This growing army of online detectives weren't only driven by curiosity, many were motivated by justice, anger, and empathy. Some were survivors of domestic violence or had experienced complex custody battles themselves. Others were students of criminology, data analysts, or retired professionals putting their skills to use. Their goal was not fame, but resolution, to bring closure to Lauren Mitchell, to give justice to the memory of Ella and Kate, and to ensure that Travis would never truly escape the reach of consequence. But with this surge in public engagement came darker consequences. Fake sightings began to flood tip lines, wasting valuable time. Misidentified men, some with superficial resemblance to Travis, were harassed or doxxed. At least 2 false positives led to brief detentions, one of which resulted in a lawsuit. Misinformation spread rapidly, amplified by platforms more interested in click-through rates than truth. Conspiracy theorists began peddling narratives that the entire case had been a setup, a psychological operation, or even a false flag meant to test the American legal system. The case was no longer just a manhunt, it had become a symbol, a cultural myth, and a battlefield for digital narratives. Meanwhile, Travis's profile continued to evolve in public imagination. He was no longer simply a missing fugitive. In some corners, he had become folklore. Urban legends sprouted around his escape. Some believed he lived in a self-made bunker in the Appalachian wilderness. Others were convinced he had plastic surgery and now ran a boat repair shop under a fake identity in South America. Every few months, new theories circulated, each one stranger and more imaginative than the last. Despite the fantastical noise, federal agencies quietly kept the case active. Travis Decker remained on the most wanted list. New agents were briefed on the case. Periodic audits were run to refresh digital profiles, check financial systems for anomalies, and monitor border crossings. A small task force rotated in fresh eyes every few years, ensuring institutional memory didn't fade. Officially, he was still a fugitive. Unofficially, he was a ghost, vanished, mythologized, but never forgotten. The cold case files grew thicker. The original investigators retired. Technology advanced. But the core facts remained unchanged. 2 girls were dead. A father had fled. And the internet, with its infinite memory and tireless obsession, had become both archive and arena, ensuring that Travis Decker's story would never truly disappear, even if he did. The Travis Decker case, in all its tragedy and controversy, came to define a generation's evolving understanding of justice, safety, and digital permanence. It was no longer just a criminal investigation, it had become a societal turning point. Institutions that had once operated in strict silos began to reconsider how they collaborated, how they communicated, and how they assessed threats in the modern age. In the aftermath of the tragedy, a collective reckoning emerged that stretched far beyond the quiet neighborhood where it all began. Legal systems were the first to feel the impact. Family courts, long shielded from public scrutiny due to the privacy of domestic disputes, suddenly found themselves under an intense national microscope. Judges across the country were urged to re-examine how they weighed custody claims involving emotional abuse, threats, or psychological instability, issues that previously lacked clear frameworks or measurable risk assessments. Several state-level task forces were launched to determine whether the legal process inadvertently enabled danger by emphasizing parental parity over child protection. Court procedures became more cautious, and the once routine granting of unsupervised visitation was re-evaluated in high-conflict cases. Psychological risk evaluations were standardized in several jurisdictions as a result. Mental health professionals worked with family court systems to develop protocols for identifying nonviolent but high-risk behaviors, such as obsession with control, extreme isolation, or digital radicalization. These assessments, once considered peripheral, were now central to courtroom decisions. Judges began requiring both parents in contentious custody cases to undergo independent evaluations, not just the one being accused or scrutinized. In the law enforcement world, the Decker case became required learning material in training academies. It was cited in updated FBI and U.S. Marshals protocols for identifying patterns of long-term premeditation, particularly in suspects without prior criminal records. Officers were trained to treat digital behavior, such as social media posting patterns, search history, and online group memberships, as essential components of psychological profiling. A new understanding emerged that modern fugitives could disappear not by running faster, but by digitally erasing themselves years in advance. Tech companies were also compelled to reflect on their role. Data privacy, while crucial for protecting users, had also created safe zones for those plotting to disappear. In response to public pressure, a few platforms collaborated with federal agencies to allow limited access to deleted metadata in cases involving missing children or fugitives suspected of violent crimes. The balance between privacy and justice had become more fragile, and more fiercely debated, than ever before. The educational system, too, integrated lessons from the case into professional development programs. Teachers, counselors, and social workers began receiving training on identifying children caught in high-conflict custody battles who might be emotionally or psychologically at risk. Awareness campaigns helped school staff better understand the warning signs of coercive parenting, child manipulation, or isolation by one parent. Administrators updated protocols for dealing with last-minute custody order changes, learning from how Travis used legal ambiguity to remove the children under seemingly legitimate pretenses. In the broader cultural landscape, the Decker tragedy redefined how the public engaged with crime stories. True crime media, once dominated by cold detachment or sensationalism, shifted toward more human-centered storytelling. Podcasts, documentaries, and digital creators began focusing on the victims, their lives, their futures lost, rather than elevating the criminal as the focal point. The term murder media fatigue emerged to describe public discomfort with glamorizing killers, and creators faced growing ethical expectations when covering real tragedies. More importantly, the story sparked nationwide conversations about fatherhood, masculinity, and emotional repression. Social researchers and public commentators explored how societal pressures to appear in control at all costs could lead men to internalize failure and weaponize pain. Travis Decker had become an uncomfortable example of what can happen when rage, shame, and entitlement combine with a sense of systemic betrayal. Support groups and nonprofit organizations began offering targeted mental health resources for fathers in custody disputes, aimed at disrupting the cycle before it could turn dangerous. For victims' advocacy groups, the Decker case provided painful clarity. The systems meant to protect children were not just flawed, they were outdated. These organizations lobbied for more trauma-informed policies in every part of the judicial process. Their push led to increased funding for child psychologists in family courts, better emergency response protocols when protective parents reported threats, and a rise in laws that elevated the voices of children in custody decisions. Even the field of criminology changed. University programs used the case to teach future investigators about the hidden dimensions of domestic violence, particularly in non-physical forms. Emotional abuse, control tactics, and long-term psychological manipulation were reframed as not just relational issues but potential precursors to criminal escalation. Graduate theses, journal articles, and books explored the Decker case as a multi-layered cautionary tale that defied traditional classifications of motive and pathology. The national memory of the crime evolved with each passing year. As the facts remained frozen and the manhunt stalled, what grew instead was a network of responses, legal, cultural, psychological, that touched nearly every aspect of American society. The case stopped being about whether Travis would be found. It became about making sure nothing like it ever happened again. Yet despite all the reform, all the awareness, and all the data, one unshakable truth persisted: for some individuals, no amount of intervention can fully anticipate the moment they decide to cross the line. And in that terrifying unknown, the legacy of the Decker case endured, not as a solved mystery, but as a grim reminder that the line between family and danger can be far thinner than anyone is prepared to admit. Despite the passage of time, the image of Travis Decker still lingered, etched not only in wanted posters, but in the collective memory of a nation unsettled by the idea that someone so seemingly ordinary could commit the unthinkable and vanish without a trace. He became more than a fugitive, he became a modern ghost. Somewhere between myth and reality, Travis represented a deeper fear in the American psyche, the idea that anyone could harbor darkness just beneath the surface, and that accountability, no matter how urgent, could be evaded entirely. Over the years, tips continued to trickle into law enforcement agencies. A man resembling Travis was seen pumping gas in rural Nevada. Another was spotted fishing along a riverbank in Idaho. A store clerk in Montana swore she sold supplies to a man who matched his profile: quiet, pale, carrying cash, and avoiding eye contact. Each lead brought a flurry of attention and resources, but none yielded confirmation. He was always just out of reach, always close enough to seem real, yet distant enough to remain untouchable. The United States Marshals Service maintained him on their 15 most wanted list, noting his potential danger and resourcefulness. For them, the case was both professional and personal. Travis had manipulated the system, used it against itself, and walked away from a crime scene that should have ended in immediate capture. He was a failure point in their network, a stain that wouldn't wash out. And as each year passed, the embarrassment grew heavier, because the longer he evaded justice, the more the public questioned whether the system was capable of stopping men like him. What made the situation worse was that Travis had planned ahead. He hadn't simply reacted in the heat of passion or panic, he had prepared. That made him exponentially harder to track. Investigators believed he may have studied survivalist manuals, practiced wilderness navigation, and possibly constructed a long-term plan to vanish, one that involved alternate identities, cash reserves, and rural hideouts. Some speculated he crossed into Canada shortly after the incident, while others were convinced he had never left the contiguous U.S. and was simply hiding in plain sight under a stolen identity. Inquiries into his financial history revealed deliberate behavior leading up to the tragedy. Months before the murders, he had quietly closed certain accounts, transferred funds through shell companies, and purchased outdoor equipment through third-party vendors. Investigators found patterns consistent with someone preparing for disappearance, not someone preparing to surrender or seek forgiveness. It was cold, clinical, and terrifyingly effective. Despite the lack of physical leads, the psychological hunt intensified. Behavioral analysts built extensive profiles of his mindset, drawing from everything available: past emails, recorded court transcripts, counseling notes, and online posts. The profile painted a disturbing picture of a man who saw himself as a righteous victim, a person who believed that his suffering justified any act, no matter how brutal. This mindset, they concluded, made him not only dangerous but extremely committed to never being found. His escape wasn't about freedom, it was about control. Disappearing was his final act of dominance. Among the general public, the case became a warning tale for a new generation of parents, lawyers, and mental health professionals. Seminars were held across the country about invisible threats in domestic custody cases. Law schools developed new courses about how to spot behavioral red flags in civil courtrooms. Parenting groups across social media circulated checklists about signs of coercive control, citing Travis Decker as a worst-case scenario. The tragedy also reached international crime study circles. Criminologists from Europe and Australia analyzed the case as an example of how the digital age enables a new kind of criminal, those who don't rely on brute force or financial power, but on data awareness, emotional manipulation, and digital erasure. They noted how Travis had studied the systems around him and weaponized their limitations. Unlike traditional fugitives who made mistakes and left breadcrumbs, Travis seemed to understand exactly what not to do. To this day, no one has claimed to have spoken to him. No voice recordings, no intercepted messages, no sightings with irrefutable evidence. His social security number remains inactive. His passport shows no activity. No fingerprints have matched in any database, and no DNA has been tied to any of the unidentified bodies logged across the country since his disappearance. He is a ghost in every way the system measures presence. The FBI's Cold Case Division continues to run new analyses periodically, especially as artificial intelligence tools become more powerful. Age progression software updates his photo every few years. Biometric reconstruction attempts have tried to predict facial alterations due to stress, malnutrition, or climate exposure. Databases now use these advanced models when comparing against surveillance footage or missing persons reports. But every attempt has hit the same wall: total silence. Still, for the families impacted, especially Lauren Mitchell, the silence is worse than a prison sentence. There is no justice, no courtroom resolution, no final moment of closure. There is only the unanswered question that keeps resurfacing: where is he? That question has kept Lauren from fully healing. It has haunted investigators who retire without resolution. And it continues to draw in ordinary people, captivated by the possibility that a man capable of such horror could be walking among them, unnoticed. In the end, Travis Decker's shadow stretches longer than most fugitives. His vanishing act didn't just cheat justice, it forced society to re-evaluate its own blind spots, to admit that not every threat is loud, not every criminal is chaotic, and not every killer gets caught. Some, like Travis, slip into the margins, out of sight, but never out of mind. As the years stretched on, the case of Travis Decker shifted from an active pursuit to a lingering wound in the nation's collective conscience. Justice, in its traditional form, remained elusive. There was no trial, no verdict, no punishment. Only an echo, of two young girls whose lives were stolen, of a mother left behind to grieve in limbo, and of a system unable to bring the guilty to account. For the American public, the case became symbolic of something larger, the terrifying realization that justice doesn't always arrive, even when guilt is certain. For victims' families, time does not dull the absence, it simply hardens it. Lauren Mitchell, whose life was publicly shattered and then slowly recast in the spotlight of tragedy, became an emblem of maternal strength. She advocated for reform, spoke at conferences, pushed for changes in court protocols, and created a foundation in Ella and Kate's name. Yet none of it could fill the hollow space left by their absence. Her face appeared in interviews, but her pain, though controlled, never disappeared. She smiled through speeches about policy shifts and custody law revisions, but behind each effort was a mother haunted by memories that no reform could resurrect. Other families, inspired by her strength, came forward with their own stories: fathers denied custody, mothers ignored by judges, grandparents watching helplessly as children were placed in homes they feared were unsafe. The Decker case had sparked a cultural re-examination of how child custody disputes are adjudicated, and how unseen dangers, emotional manipulation, psychological coercion, silent rage, can explode into violence. Lawmakers were compelled to draft child protection before parity legislation in several states, prioritizing safety over presumed fairness in high-conflict custody battles. Still, the legal system could only react, not undo. That irreversible damage created a philosophical tension around justice. When the courts cannot impose punishment, and the guilty disappear, can justice ever truly be achieved? Academics and legal philosophers debated this question in law schools and ethics panels, often using the Decker case as their central thesis. Was closure a courtroom sentence? A symbolic reckoning? Or simply society's unending memory of what went wrong? Some argued that justice lived in the collective refusal to forget. Media coverage refused to let the story fade. Every anniversary brought new retrospectives. Documentaries revisited the case with updated visuals, expert analysis, and commentary from those who still pursued him. Podcasts continued to dissect every step leading up to the tragedy. In these repeated tellings, the public preserved accountability, even in the absence of a courtroom confession or a mugshot. For others, however, these constant reminders were double-edged swords. They kept awareness high but also reopened wounds. Families of other victims, particularly those in similarly unresolved cases, voiced their fatigue. They questioned whether national obsession with a single fugitive was hindering attention for the hundreds of other missing or murdered children whose names rarely made headlines. Advocacy groups began pushing for balanced media coverage that gave voice to less sensational, but equally devastating, cases. Despite the broader debate, the Decker case remained unique because of how calculated it was. Travis did not act in a fit of impulsive rage, he acted with deliberation. He weaponized his knowledge of the system. That fact alone separated his case from countless others. He had been intelligent, methodical, and disturbingly patient. His crime was not only horrifying, it was strategic. And that strategy is what unsettled both the public and professionals the most. Over time, the manhunt itself evolved. As facial recognition tools improved, authorities attempted to cross-reference Decker's features against images from surveillance networks in remote areas, national parks, and even international border regions. Aging software was used to simulate various physical changes, facial hair, weight loss, weathering, or surgical alteration. Yet even with these tools, not a single confirmed sighting emerged. The closest leads were always speculative: a lone traveler in Alaska, a drifter in Oregon, a survivalist in northern Maine. A national database was updated yearly to log every unidentified male body between the ages of 30 and 50 found under mysterious circumstances. Dozens of remains were compared against DNA profiles on file for Decker, but none matched. He remained an outlier in every way. The absence of evidence was his only consistent trail. With each passing year, another question gained volume: what if he was already dead? Some law enforcement officials believed he might have died in the wilderness early in his escape, his remains scattered by nature, unrecoverable. Others argued he may have taken his own life after ensuring no one would find him. But there was no proof, only theory. And in the absence of certainty, hope and fear lived side by side. For many Americans, Travis Decker became a phantom of the justice system. His story haunted courtrooms, training seminars, legislative sessions, and the public imagination. Not because of what he might still do, but because of what he had already done, and the fact that no one could stop him. He was a man who bypassed every safeguard, sidestepped every check, and committed a crime so deliberate that even time could not bury its implications. In the final accounting, justice in the Decker case never arrived in the way people expected. It did not come with handcuffs or a trial. It came in the form of memory, in the reform that followed, and in the vigilance that now surrounds every similar case. It came through the enduring voice of those who refuse to let the story fade. In a world that often confuses punishment with closure, perhaps the only justice that remains is the unrelenting truth, spoken, remembered, and never erased. Travis Decker's crimes were horrifying in their outcome, but what made them truly disturbing was the underlying psychology. He wasn't a man who snapped, he was a man who built a reality around control, one brick at a time, until every move he made was part of a larger design. Understanding Travis required more than criminal profiling. It required peeling back the layers of calculated behavior that had been hiding in plain sight for years. His actions weren't the eruption of chaos, they were the result of a long, quiet, methodical descent. Control had always been central to Travis's personality. Those who interacted with him described him as meticulous, composed, and unusually observant. He was not loud or aggressive, but deeply structured. In therapy sessions accessed later by investigators, he often referred to fairness and order in absolute terms. Everything had a place, every wrong had a balance, and everyone owed something to someone. When life veered off course, when custody rulings didn't go his way or when others didn't comply with his version of the truth, it wasn't a matter of disappointment. It was a matter of injustice in his mind. People with this rigid worldview often develop what psychologists refer to as compensatory narcissism. On the surface, they don't present as overtly arrogant or domineering. Instead, they internalize a deep sense of superiority rooted in their belief that they suffer more than others, understand more than others, and are ultimately more entitled to reclaim control when it's lost. This belief system festers in silence, and when paired with high intelligence and emotional suppression, it can lead to deeply disturbing behavior patterns. Travis had long used emotional detachment as a survival skill. In childhood, he had experienced loss and instability, something he rarely acknowledged, even in his own writings. But those who knew his history say he was taught early on that expressing emotion led to punishment or abandonment. That early conditioning evolved into a psychological armor. He observed others, mirrored appropriate emotions, but never fully engaged with them. Over time, this made him remarkably effective at appearing calm even under pressure, while inwardly suppressing resentment that would eventually metastasize into rage. Control extended beyond his emotional regulation. It showed up in his routines, his parenting, and his digital presence. Emails and messages recovered during the investigation revealed a man obsessed with narrative. He documented everything, often twisting details to fit his perception of victimhood. He framed himself as the misunderstood father, the man pushed to the edge, the one no one would listen to. In this internal story, Travis was never the threat, he was the protector. And in his warped sense of justice, reclaiming his daughters was not a crime, but a restoration of order. This kind of cognitive distortion is common among perpetrators of premeditated violence. They don't see themselves as villains. They construct an entire worldview in which they are heroes facing an uncaring system, a malicious partner, or a society that refuses to see their truth. For Travis, this distortion became the foundation of everything he did in the months leading up to the murders. Each ignored email, each court hearing loss, each moment of perceived disrespect added fuel to a growing narrative of betrayal. His behavior also aligned with covert coercive control, a psychological tactic not always visible from the outside. While he didn't isolate his children in the traditional sense, he manipulated their environment subtly, using language, emotional leverage, and repetition to erode their perception of others. Witnesses close to the family recalled how Travis would speak calmly but decisively about their mother in front of them, creating an undercurrent of doubt. He sowed seeds over time, reinforcing that he was the only one who truly understood them, truly loved them, and could truly keep them safe. This slow-building indoctrination is a hallmark of emotional abusers who rely on manipulation rather than threats. By the time the tragedy unfolded, the children had likely been subjected to months, if not years, of carefully curated narratives meant to isolate them psychologically from their mother and the outside world. While it's impossible to know the full extent of their mental state, the evidence suggested they were being drawn deeper into their father's controlled environment, even if they didn't consciously recognize it. Digital evidence further reinforced his controlling nature. Investigators found that Travis had erased vast amounts of data in the days before the crime, but what remained showed obsessive pattern tracking, spreadsheets of visitation schedules, legal documents, quotes from court rulings, and personal journals with calculated reflections. He wasn't just preparing to flee, he was designing a world where he could justify everything he was about to do. That justification, in his mind, was complete and unshakable. For forensic psychologists, Travis Decker's profile became an invaluable, if chilling, case study. He illustrated the dangers of silent radicalization, not through political ideology, but through personal delusion. His dissent wasn't broadcasted through social media rants or violent outbursts. It happened in silence, behind carefully managed facades, and was executed with the precision of someone who had decided long ago how the story would end. The enduring lesson of Travis's psychological profile is that not all threats scream for attention. Some smile. Some comply. Some nod politely in courtrooms while secretly rewriting the rules of justice in their own minds. Travis Decker wasn't just a man who broke the law, he was a man who believed the law no longer applied to him. And that belief, left unchallenged and unseen, was what made him so dangerous. In the digital age, most criminals leave behind footprints, emails, text messages, surveillance captures, search histories, financial transactions, GPS logs. The internet, for all its freedom, is also a net that tightens around the careless. But Travis Decker defied that reality. His disappearance was not just a physical vanishing, it was a digital erasure, almost surgical in its execution. For law enforcement, tech analysts, and cybercrime specialists, the most baffling part of the Decker case wasn't just what he did, it was how, in an era of total connectivity, he managed to disappear so completely. Travis had been tech-savvy long before his crime. Not in the sense of being a hacker or coder, but as a meticulous student of digital systems. Colleagues from his previous jobs described him as the type who read user manuals from start to finish, not just for tools but for software platforms. He was methodical. He understood metadata, user permissions, data syncing, and deletion protocols. His understanding wasn't flashy or advanced, but exact. Enough to navigate systems with precision, and most importantly, enough to hide. In the months leading up to the tragedy, Travis made small but meaningful changes to his digital footprint. He switched devices. He moved away from cloud backups. He started using browsers with private modes and changed his habits for storing and accessing information. These weren't immediately noticeable changes, but in hindsight, they revealed a pattern of digital withdrawal. He stopped using GPS-dependent apps. He limited interactions on social platforms. And he began isolating his communication to encrypted channels, though even those were used sparingly. His internet history, when recovered, showed nothing inflammatory or revealing. No searches for violent content. No deep dives into criminal tactics. No red flags. If anything, it was sanitized. Generic. Almost too clean. Investigators later suspected he used burner devices or offline libraries to research whatever planning he had done. Public computers, VPNs, disposable emails, these were all likely tools, but he never left enough of a pattern to confirm. And that was what made his escape so frustratingly effective. Financially, he moved with similar subtlety. Instead of draining accounts all at once or making sudden purchases that would alert banks or family, he gradually siphoned small amounts of money. A few $100s from one card, a withdrawal from a separate bank, purchases that looked normal but served deeper purposes, camping gear, non-perishable food, fuel canisters. Over time, he built a reserve of untraceable currency. And when the time came, he didn't leave behind a trail of reckless spending. He vanished without a single flagged transaction. Authorities also found that Travis had paid attention to surveillance blind spots. He knew which gas stations lacked high-definition cameras. He likely took rural routes, avoided toll roads, and traveled by night. His vehicle was later found abandoned in a national forest, but with no fingerprints inside, wiped clean, including the seatbelt and steering wheel. Every trace was meticulously removed. It was as if he had studied how fugitives were caught, and did everything in reverse. In a strange way, his preparation resembled that of someone preparing for a digital death. Not just escape, but erasure. As though his goal wasn't only to avoid being found, but to never be proven to have existed beyond that final moment. And in doing so, Travis highlighted an uncomfortable truth: even in a world of constant tracking, some people can still go dark, if they know how. Cybersecurity experts who later reviewed the case admitted that Travis likely exploited gaps in everyday systems. He hadn't hacked government servers or used cutting-edge technology. He had simply understood the tools available to ordinary people, and used them masterfully. Disposable SIM cards, cash-only purchases, pre-2000 vehicles without GPS tracking, libraries with outdated surveillance. His knowledge wasn't futuristic. It was old-school and profoundly effective. Even facial recognition systems failed to pick up any credible matches. Analysts believed he may have altered his appearance in subtle but critical ways: growing a beard, losing weight, wearing glasses, changing his gait. These small changes can throw off most systems not trained for nuance. And when paired with rural isolation or off-the-grid communities, the possibility of blending in without ever resurfacing became more plausible. Ultimately, law enforcement agencies admitted that Travis Decker represented a worst-case scenario, a criminal who prepared, studied, and executed an escape not just in the physical world, but in the digital one. His absence became a case study in counterforensics. Universities used it in lectures about data trails and their vulnerabilities. Agencies revised their protocols for tracking domestic fugitives. And technology firms began reviewing how accessible their tools were for those intending to disappear. For the public, the lesson was sobering. The assumption that everyone could be tracked, traced, or caught was false. The myth of the digital panopticon, that no one can truly vanish, was cracked. Travis had broken the system not by overpowering it, but by understanding it better than most. And perhaps most chilling of all was the realization that, even now, someone could be planning something similar, watching, reading, studying Travis's case not for justice, but for inspiration. Because in a world where silence is rare, and privacy nearly extinct, Travis Decker had accomplished the one thing almost no one else could: he became invisible. As time passed, Travis Decker's name took on a strange duality. In one realm, he remained a cold case fugitive, an unfinished story on law enforcement databases, a manhunt stalled by the absence of leads. But in another realm, one driven by collective fear, fascination, and cultural myth-making, Travis transformed into something more than a missing suspect. He became a legend. And legends, unlike cases, don't require facts to grow, they only need mystery. In online forums and amateur crime communities, Travis's disappearance was dissected endlessly. Armchair detectives created timelines, maps, and psychological profiles. Reddit threads were filled with theories ranging from plausible to wildly speculative. Some believed he was living in a remote cabin off the grid, others claimed he had crossed borders and assumed a new identity in another country. A few suggested he had died shortly after fleeing, and his body lay undiscovered somewhere deep in the wilderness. But no theory, no matter how popular, ever led to resolution. True crime podcasts seized on the story. Multiple series featured multi-episode arcs detailing the background, the custody battle, the murders, the escape, and the aftermath. Travis wasn't portrayed as a celebrity, there was no glorification, but the obsessive coverage gave him a strange permanence in cultural memory. He became shorthand for a certain kind of fear, the intelligent, quiet man who snapped without warning and vanished without a trace. The kind of criminal who defied categorization and capture. This mythology had consequences. While some viewed the persistent coverage as a necessary public reminder, others criticized it for creating an aura of mystique around someone who committed horrific crimes. Victims' rights groups warned against inadvertently romanticizing fugitives. They pushed for narratives that focused more on the lives lost, on Ella and Kate, on the trauma left behind, rather than the dark allure of the man who destroyed them. Yet the allure persisted. News specials recapped the story every anniversary. Where is Travis Decker? Became the central question not just of law enforcement but of a public drawn to unsolved mysteries. Each new technology promised a breakthrough. Each new facial recognition update, each AI-assisted database sweep, each satellite imaging pass gave brief hope. But every search ended the same way: silence. For criminologists and behavioral analysts, Travis's mythology offered a cautionary study. When a fugitive escapes long enough, they shift from being a criminal to being a symbol of systemic failure, of the unpredictability of people, of justice deferred. They represent what the system can't control. And that unnerves both professionals and the public. It's not just that he vanished. It's that he did so with such efficiency and precision. It challenged assumptions about surveillance, law enforcement reach, and the illusion of total visibility in modern society. Worse, some dark corners of the internet began idolizing his story. Not the crime itself, but the escape. Individuals disillusioned with authority or obsessed with the idea of outwitting the system began using Travis as a reference point. Videos appeared analyzing his possible exit strategies, survivalist methods, and psychological detachment. While these digital artifacts never praised the murders, they fetishized the idea of eluding justice. And in doing so, they warped the narrative. This prompted action from content platforms and moderators. Videos and posts that crossed the line into glorification were flagged or removed. Advocacy organizations launched counter-campaigns highlighting the victims' stories, refocusing attention on who truly mattered. But the fact that such narratives had to be countered at all was a reminder of how mythologies can spiral beyond control. Meanwhile, Travis's image evolved. Age progression renderings appeared online and in public service announcements. He was imagined with facial hair, sun damage, glasses, weight loss, or gain. Artists created mock-ups of disguises he might use. But no updated image ever led to identification. Not a single tip confirmed his location. Not one sighting proved authentic. Each time someone came forward with a claim, a man seen in Wyoming, someone fitting his profile in New Mexico, it unraveled under scrutiny. The lack of closure meant that for many, the case became personal. Families who had experienced similar losses saw their own pain reflected in the void left by the Decker case. Victims' advocates, law enforcement officers, and child psychologists all used the story as a reference point for needed reforms in family court systems and child custody protocols. But in public consciousness, the story never fully settled into a lesson. It hovered, unresolved and unsettling. The transformation of Travis Decker from a man into a myth speaks to something deeply human, the discomfort of not knowing. People can process loss, even horrific loss, if it comes with answers. But when tragedy is paired with mystery, it lodges itself in the cultural imagination. It lingers. It haunts. And over time, the person at the center becomes less real and more symbolic. Ultimately, the mythology of Travis Decker is not about fascination, it's about fear. Fear that someone could do everything by the book, smile for every photo, play the part of a devoted father, and still commit unspeakable acts. Fear that someone could vanish in a world designed to track movement. Fear that even now, years later, he could be walking past unnoticed. That fear is why his story endures. Not as closure, but as a warning. Years have passed, but the silence around Travis Decker's whereabouts has only grown louder. It echoes not only through law enforcement databases and old case files, but through the lives that were directly and irreversibly altered. Justice, which many hoped would eventually arrive, remains painfully absent. And in that void, what lingers is not just mystery, but a societal reckoning with failure, vulnerability, and the burden of questions no one can yet answer. The psychological weight on the community, especially those closest to the case, never fully lifts. For the extended family members of Ella and Kate, closure has remained suspended in time. Their lives split in two, the time before the tragedy, and everything after. Birthdays pass without celebration, anniversaries without peace. Their grief, once acute and searing, has dulled into something deeper and more complex, a quiet, persistent ache shaped by the lack of finality. The absence of a trial means no public reckoning, no formal accounting of the horrors. It leaves loved ones clinging to personal truths without the validation that legal justice often provides. For law enforcement agencies involved, the case has been a lesson in both limitation and accountability. It revealed cracks in procedure, assumptions made about digital traceability, and the vulnerability of systems designed to protect victims. The investigation wasn't negligent, but it was reactive. By the time the alarm was sounded, Travis had already implemented a plan. And in hindsight, each missed signal, each unfiled concern, each dismissed intuition, became a point of painful reflection. Policy reviews followed. Training protocols were updated. Domestic violence threat assessments were made more rigorous. But these improvements, while necessary, arrived too late for the Decker family. Social workers, counselors, and family court judges across the country took notice. Travis's manipulation of custody hearings and legal ambiguity forced a re-evaluation of how psychological abuse and coercive control are handled in custody disputes. The emotional manipulation he inflicted didn't meet traditional thresholds for intervention, and that gap proved deadly. Now, more jurisdictions are beginning to factor in patterns of control, not just overt violence, when determining custody and visitation rights. The hope is that future cases will recognize emotional red flags before they escalate into irreversible outcomes. Media coverage, once relentless, has also changed its tone. Early stories focused on the spectacle, the shocking betrayal, the clean escape, the vanishing act. But over time, reporting shifted to highlight the consequences of systemic gaps and the enduring pain of victims' families. Journalists and documentarians began prioritizing advocacy over sensationalism. Stories were told not to relive the crime, but to prevent the next one. In that reframing, the legacy of the case took on a different shape, not just a mystery, but a motivator for change. Meanwhile, the manhunt continues, if quietly. Every few months, a tip surfaces. A sighting in Montana. A vague photo from Canada. A hiker in Utah who resembled Travis's last known image. Each lead is investigated, followed, and eventually closed. The FBI maintains an open file. His face remains in national databases. But the trail, long cold, shows no signs of heating up. Privately, many agents acknowledge what they can't say publicly. The likelihood of finding Travis alive grows smaller with each passing year. Not because he's been caught, but because it's entirely possible he no longer exists. Still, others believe he's very much alive. They imagine a man watching news stories from a remote cabin, changing his identity every few years, staying ahead of the grid. They point to his planning, his methodical personality, and his knowledge of law enforcement procedures. For them, the absence of discovery is proof of his continued evasion. These are the believers who won't let the file be closed. They argue that giving up is dangerous. That as long as he lives free, the justice system remains unfinished. For the general public, the story of Travis Decker endures as a haunting parable. It's brought into classrooms, podcasts, documentaries, and conferences not just for its shock value, but for the uncomfortable truths it reveals. It challenges assumptions about who can be dangerous, how abuse manifests, and how justice can sometimes be outmaneuvered. It reminds people that evil doesn't always wear a villain's face. That monsters don't always hide in shadows, they often hide in plain sight. The absence of resolution has become its own form of punishment, not for Travis, but for the people left behind. Every year that passes without answers chips away at the illusion that justice is inevitable. But it also builds a deeper, more determined resolve among those who continue to fight for it. Foundations have been created in Ella and Kate's names. Scholarships awarded. Support networks expanded. These actions don't erase the loss, but they ensure it's not forgotten. In the end, the story of Travis Decker doesn't close with a capture or a confession. It closes with a question mark that forces society to look inward. To ask what warning signs it missed. To confront the limits of systems meant to protect. And to carry forward the names of the innocent, not just in grief, but in action. Justice is not always delivered in a courtroom. Sometimes, it's delivered in the vigilance that follows. In the laws that change. In the people who refuse to stop asking questions. And in that way, the echo of this tragedy continues, not as silence, but as a promise. What kind of man walks away from everything, and still leaves a trail soaked in silence and blood? The story of Travis Decker isn't just about a disappearance, it's about the justice that never came, the questions that remain buried, and the lives forever changed by the evil no one saw coming. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, then let it echo. Like, comment, and share, because stories like this need to be heard. Not just once, but until justice wakes up. This was another descent into the dark truths that hide in plain sight. Only on Mr. Dar's Nights, where the shadows speak and the silence tells the real story. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what's coming next is even darker.